Welcome back to part 3 of a very abridged history of aerospace engineering. In the previous 2 videos, we discussed the prehistory or mythology around aerospace engineering through buoyant flight. Then we talked about aerodynes, as in aircraft or vehicles that fly through the air, both fixed wing and rotary wing. Today, we are going to talk about space and spacecraft and the history of spacecraft. The history of spaceflight mirrors that of the history of air flight. We have myths from far in the past, and we have capabilities and technologies that were developed in some cases thousands of years ago. So what is this? This is an example of an early solid rocket motor. What we would think of today as stuff used for fireworks or battle rockets. It was invented by the Chinese. And we use fire, and they made arrows, rocket-propelled arrows. They did fireworks and the like. How does this relate to space? Well, we have multiple ways of getting into space today, one of which is solid rockets. These take and draw their lineage directly from the Chinese experience. However, solid rockets are not the only way. Can we use something other than solid rockets to achieve what we want to achieve? What about liquid? Do you know who this individual is? He's an American who lived in the 20th century, and in the 1920s, he was the person who built the first liquid-propelled rocket, chemical rocket. His name is Robert Goddard, and he was a bit of an ass. So he did a lot of work, but he worked by himself. He was solitary. And as a consequence, people in America tended to ignore his inventions. It didn't go very far. Now, today we recognize him and we remember him. And NASA has the Goddard Space Flight Research Center named after him in Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. But it wasn't Goddard who propelled his invention to the future. It was someone else. It was a German by the name of Hermann Elberth. And he started a rocketry program that ultimately ended up in Peenemünde in the north coast on what's called the East Sea coast or the Baltic Sea coast of Germany. And we know his student and and we'll talk about him later, much better than we know Hermann. But Hermann really was the progenitor of this. This is the V-2 rocket as we know it, and it was created to terrorize. It was a weapon to terrorize London by the Nazis. However, the technologies in the V-2 rocket were captured by both sets of allies, the US and the Soviet Union, and they were used to further their space programs. And probably the most important early space program person was Korolev from the Soviet Union. This man drove the early Soviet space program. It started out as an ICBM, so also with military applications. But he dreamed of dominating space. And as a result, he developed this rocket. Now again, as I said, this is an ICBM. It's called the R7. And it is the progenitor of the most launched space system in history. Think about it. What space vehicle, rocket launch vehicle, do we still use today that comes from the R7? Yes, the Soyuz, the Russians use to launch astronauts and cosmonauts to the International Space Station, in addition to satellites and space probes. Now, the beauty of the R7 was it was a crappy ICBM, so it really was only good for doing things in space, and it furthered the advancement. Unfortunately, for the Soviet space program, Korolev developed cancer and died quite young. However, he has left a massive and lasting impression. What about this individual? Does anybody know who he was? He was Hermann Elberth's protege. This is Wernher von Braun. Yes, he developed the V-2 rocket, but he is best known for what he did when he was exported to America. And what I mean by exported is he surrendered to Allied troops at the end of the Second World War in spring of 1945. And the U.S. gave him an ultimatum. Either he could face war crimes trials for his role in the development and production of the V-2 rocket, both for terrorizing citizens in, say, London, but also for the use of slave labor, or he could disappear into the wilds of Alabama and work for the U.S. military on their rocketry program. He obviously chose the latter, went to Huntsville, Alabama, and further developed the rockets there, and ultimately led to this rocket, which we all know. This is the Saturn V, his probably greatest achievement. Put a man on the moon, it also put Skylab in space. And these are some of the key early bits of space and rocketry. And here we're going to talk about the first part of our artifacts of import. Now, just as a quick side note, these are things and artifacts and people further that I think are interesting through the history. And I'll tell you why I think they're interesting. However, this is not meant to be an exhaustive survey. And again, towards the end of the semester, we will come back and talk more about these artifacts of import. But let's talk about a few of these. This is Alberto Santos Dumont. He's one of the pioneers of aviation, a Frenchman who worked in both dirigibles and fixed-wing aviation. In fact, he actually holds the record as the first person to record a manned heavier-than-air controlled flight. While this flight took place after the Wright brothers first flew, he was the first person to go and announce it publicly and get it recorded. So there is some dispute over who really was the person to fly first, regardless of whether you believe it was the Wright brothers, where the photographic evidence says that they did, or Santos Dumont, who actively recorded it first. The fact of the matter is lots of people working on flying machines at the time, and it was inevitable that someone be successful. The next artifact is an actual aircraft. This is the Junebug. The Junebug, which was built by Glenn Curtiss, was the first aircraft to complete a circuit of over a mile in length. Now, we think nothing of that today, but at the time, being able to sustain flight and control without exhausting a pilot for a mile and go around and come back to the same place was a massive undertaking. This meant we had to fly fast enough that we could fly both upwind, downwind, and upwind and crosswind. We had to have control to fly crosswind. And those things were hard early on. So most early flights were in a straight line or a line with one turn. They didn't go in a circuit. So when we think about it, Junebug was a massive achievement. And he won a trophy for this because that was actually a challenge that was set out by Scientific American. The next aircraft is the Boeing 247. Now, this aircraft is really resigned to the dustbin of history. It isn't anywhere near as popular or as common as Douglas's answer to it, the DC-3. However, this aircraft holds of distinction. It is the first stress skin or semi-monocoque, so you'll learn more about that in structures, retractable gear aircraft ever built. It is the progenitor for all modern transport aircraft. Yes, it was piston engine versus a gas turbine or jet engine, and it wasn't pressurized, but every aircraft after this made use of the techniques that were pioneered. Again, it wasn't if Boeing hadn't built this, it would have never have happened. It just happens to be the first to combine all of these features. If we move on to more modern aircraft, we have this. Does anybody know what this aircraft is? For those of you who do know or don't know, it is the Boeing B-47. It was the first aircraft to display two common traits, the highly swept thin wing and the potted engines positioned beneath and in front of the wing. It is the progenitor for all modern commercial transports that we know of. It's a pressurized fuselage, high aspect ratio. In fact, it was this aircraft and the U.S. Air Force's inability to refuel it that drove the development of what became the 707. We know the 707 was not the first jet transport to enter commercial service, and that was the de Havilland Comet. But why is the 707 much more an important aircraft than the Comet? Well, the Comet was very conventional. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But The 707 established the new paradigm. However, there's one other paradigm we see in jet transports, and that is the one established by the Sud Aviation Caravelle. This is the aircraft with the rear-mounted engines and the clean wing, i.e. the DC-9, this Canada regional jet, lots of business jets. So those are really the two progenitors of every commercial transport you see today, be it an A320, a CRJ, or an A380. They all came out of these designs. What about this aircraft? Or this aircraft? These aircraft are very important, not because they're 737 or de Havilland Comet 4, but because they taught us a tremendous amount about the way aircraft structures and aircraft behave. The Comet ended up grounded because of fatigue around the navigation window was causing the fuselage to break up in flight. The lessons learned from that helped us design more robust fuselages. In fact, the 707, Boeing was so afraid of fatigue issues around windows that the 707 fuselage weighs about 10% more than the ideal design that we know today. In fact, it was those lessons learned that enabled the 737 to successfully land after having a significant fatigue issue. Now, as I said, we'll talk more about these artifacts of import towards the end of the semester. But this just gives you an idea of the way history has developed, what we've learned and what we've evolved from one thing to the other. As a wrap-up, we've covered the key history of both aeronautics and astronautics. This includes key players, their inventions and contributions, the myths and the myths surrounding some of the key players. We've talked quite quickly about some key artifacts. Aeronautical only, we'll talk more about space later. And if you are interested in following on in the book, please continue reading Anderson's chapter 11, as that has a lot more on the history. Now, if you're worried about exams and tests, don't worry. Nothing additional out of chapter 1 in Anderson is going to give you anything that you wouldn't have in these slides that you're going to be examined on. But it might add some depth and understanding that you can use later. Next time, we will talk about topic 3, which is the flight environment. This is both the atmosphere and the exoatmosphere. So thank you very much, and stay tuned.